Good afternoon, everyone. I am Bob Adler. I'm on the faculty of the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment and the College of Law, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's Green Bag. This event, this Green Bag, along with the entire series this year, is sponsored by the University of Utah Credit Union. So many thanks to the Credit Union for their support and generosity. I'd like to ask you to silence your cell phones. And please sign up the sign-up sheet that will be coming around. It helps us to track attendance and also to let you know about future events. And speaking of future events, we've got 2 other Green Bags coming up shortly. And following that, our signature Stegner Center event for the year. So the 2 Green Bags are on February 18th, same time, same place, water banking by our alumna, Emily Lewis, who is an attorney at the law firm of Clyde Snow and Sessions. On March 2nd, also same time, same place, we've got a Green Bag on the Gold King mine spill, environmental law and liability. That is being presented by our colleague Cliff Villa from the University of New Mexico School of Law. And then on March 19th and 20th, a 2-day event, our 25th Wallace Stegner Symposium. How can you miss our quarter-century symposium? But you shouldn't miss it, not only because of that, but because of the topic, which is on food and the environment, resilient and equitable food security for the West. Not only an incredibly important issue, but an incredibly interesting issue. Professor Craig, who's around here somewhere, has spearheaded that symposium and has put together a truly fascinating and remarkable set of speakers. Unlike the Green Bags, our symposium does require advance registration. There are flyers on the table outside. You can also find out about the symposium on the Stegner Center website. And with that, let's get to today's event, which is a Green Bag by our very own Professor Bob Keiter on the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem Revisited, Law, Science, and the Pursuit of Ecosystem Management in an Iconic Landscape. Now, you're used to having Bob Keiter introducing our Green Bag speakers. We decided not to make him introduce himself, but it is my great pleasure to introduce my very long-time friend and colleague, Bob Keiter. He is the Wallace Stegner Professor of Law and a University Distinguished Professor of Law. Most of you know that he is the founding director of the Stegner Center. He has a bachelor's degree with honors from Washington University, a JD with honors from Northwestern University School of Law. He taught at 3 other law schools before coming here, Wyoming, Boston College, and Southwestern. But he's been here with us for quite a few years. He's been here even longer than I have, and I've been here for more than a quarter century, so you can do the math. He teaches constitutional law and natural resources law, and he is truly one of the nation's leading experts on public land law and the law of ecosystem management, in particular, the law governing national parks and other protected lands, the crown jewels, the lands that we all treasure so much. He has written books, on the national park system, on ecosystem management, on the Wyoming State Constitution, and on the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. He has served on the board of the Greater Yellowstone Coalition and other national and local environmental organizations. This is an issue he began studying 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, in an article published in the Colorado Law Review. He decided to revisit and reassess the status of that ecosystem in this 177-page law review article. I've written some long articles, but I've never gotten to 177 pages, so a very, very detailed and interesting analysis. Please help me welcome Professor Bob Keiter.
Thank you for being here, and Bob, thank you for your generous introduction. I'm let me see, I've got something on the screen here I'm not recognizing. Let me see if I can do what I need to do. Okay, I think maybe we're here now. Okay. Good. So as Bob mentioned, 30 years ago, I took a very careful look at the Greater Yellowstone area where some really exciting things were happening. At the time, in 1989 and 91, I was involved with two separate publications. One was a law journal article, the first careful look at the evolution or the emergence of the concept of ecosystem management along with the concept of a Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And I wondered at that time what this meant for public land policy and natural resource management. So I'm going to be formal for just a couple of seconds here just to set the stage, and then we'll get into the detail, but to provide some background. So 30 years ago, the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem concept and ecosystem management surfaced as key to preserving this iconic, legally fragmented region's public lands and wildlife in the face of mounting development pressures. Yellowstone's grizzly bears were in sharp decline, wolves were absent from the landscape, while bison and elk management controversies festered. The Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem's national forest lands were subject to extensive logging, energy leasing, and other commercial activities that cumulatively threaten the region's ecological integrity. In the face of extreme jurisdictional complexity and a strong commitment to agency discretion, a high-profile federal vision effort to improve and better coordinate federal resource management practices cratered under intense political pressures. Since then, however, much has changed in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. This vision process that I mentioned came to the conclusion in a draft document that this area, I quote, should be a world-class model of ecosystem management on a landscape where natural processes are operating with little hindrance on a grand scale. Quite a vision for the federal lands in this part of the world. So my earlier study endorsed the idea of a Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and then it suggested, quote, the ecosystem concept provides the fundamental premise for regional management and thus brings a compelling new vision to the ongoing debate over the future of the public domain. A primary goal of ecosystem management, it argued, was to promote meaningful coordination between the National Park Service and the Forest Service in order to safeguard Greater Yellowstone's unique wildlife populations and other natural attributes, which collectively represented the area's cultural importance and economic future. So that's where things were 30 years ago, and that effort at the federal level, as I said, collapsed for political reasons. But nonetheless, the idea of a Greater Yellowstone ecosystem concept was in place, and the idea of trying to do something that would better coordinate resource management, particularly between the Park Service and the Forest Service, was there. So I've paid attention to what's going on in the area during the last 30 years, and I thought it was time to go back and look at what happened there, why, what the current issues were. The research that I did for this article involved extensive interviews with people who were involved 30 years ago, along with current agency officials, other advocates today, and I benefited greatly from their observations. In addition, I did extensive review of both court decisions, documents, environmental impact statements, and the like. I've got photos of some of the people among the 37 that I interviewed for the study. So to set the stage of the setting, here you've got a map of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. If you'll notice, in the center is the Yellowstone National Park. To the south, Grand Teton National Park in purple, the core of this Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, surrounded by a lot of green. The darker green are National Forest wilderness areas. The lighter green are national forests. There, 5 national forests today make up the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Add to that 3 national wildlife refuges, the fact that this is the headwaters for 3 major river systems, and it's still an ecologically integrated and relatively natural landscape that includes natural processes functioning pretty much as they have. Today, all of the original species at the time of white arrival in the area, exploration by Europeans, are there, and the ecosystem is in decent shape. Back 30 years ago, when I was beginning to take a look at this, the ecosystem was defined in terms of 12 to 14 million acres. If you look carefully at the map, you'll see, I think it's a purple line outlining what is today regarded as the GYE at 20 million acres. And as I'll suggest, it's even larger than that now. Also worth mentioning, 30 years ago, the term climate change, absent from all of the materials that I dealt with and with my own studies then. And likewise, a little concern about human development pressures on private lands. So moving from the natural setting then to the human dimension, here we have over the past 30 years what one astute commentator has suggested is the emergence of a new West in the GYE, defined in his terms, Craig Schaefer, as a shift away from the old West heritage of utilitarian extraction toward a new culture of natural amenity-minded transplants influenced by new ideas about nature and motivated to both enjoy and protect its natural amenities. The presence of, if you will, these transplants along with local citizens has led to a transformation in terms of the economic activity in the area, a movement away from commodity production, think timber, mining, and the like, to an economy predicated or based largely on tourism, recreation, real estate development, etc. We've seen a number of hot spots come to the fore. Bozeman, Teton Valley, Idaho, Jackson Hole, the list goes on of communities that are now quite attractive and bring a lot of people to the GYE who not only visit but also stay. Part of this transformation is reflected in the fact that today in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem there are some 180 non-governmental organizations that are engaged in conservation activity, and that includes significantly, since I look at this from the perspective of law among other things, an Earth Justice Office that was founded and continues today in Bozeman and provides lawyers for many of these groups. The consequence of all of this, recreational pressures have escalated, development pressures on private lands have escalated. One of my most astute interviewees observed the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem front country is now filled up and the region's backcountry is becoming increasingly crowded. The legal framework governing the area. As the earlier slide noted, predominance of federal lands in the area. You've got the 4 major federal land managing agencies responsible for those lands that make up about 3/4 of the size of the GYE. Federal law is quite predominant. It has changed little over the course of 30 years, with the exception of some revisions to the Forest Service's planning rules and a roadless area rule that is in place for the National Forest. The federal agencies have evolved, particularly the Forest Service. It is a different agency today than it was 30 years ago. It's reflected in the diversity of its workforce, both in terms of gender and ethnicity, but also in terms of professional competence. 30 years ago, the Forest Service was primarily made up of silviculturalists. Today, you have virtually all the different scientific disciplines represented in the Forest Service, and they're concerned about the health of the National Forest landscape. Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee was functioning 30 years ago. It continues in the aftermath of the vision process that I alluded to begin with. It has been quite reluctant to undertake any sort of large visionary look at or comprehensive approach to the region. It has an executive coordinator in place today. I probably should also note that it is not legally provided for by law. It is a creation, a de facto creation of the different federal agencies to help promote some level of coordination. Importantly, in addition to the federal lands, the GYE extends across 3 states, Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, and as a consequence, state law is an important player, particularly when it comes to wildlife management or land use. The net result, given the lay of the land, the different entities involved, legal complexity, and real jurisdictional fragmentation, all crying out for a level of coordination. Conservation science has matured over the last 30 years. We now accept the notion that nature is unpredictable, that it exists in a disequilibrium type of state, that change is sometimes unpredictable. We've rejected the old balance of nature notion. Ecosystems change and evolve regularly, sometimes dramatically. We've also rejected the enclave notion of conservation, that is, that all we have to do is create a national park and the things that are in it are fully protected and will be forever. We recognize that boundaries do not ensure full protection for conservation purposes. Many argue that we've now entered the age of the Anthropocene, where humans dominate the world. Climate change is a constant fact of life. The net result is that nature conservation strategies have evolved. Now we see a 3-part strategy reflected on the slide that includes landscape scale planning and connectivity through corridors in order to address climate change. Attention today is the general management approach of the National Park Service. Let nature prevail, let nature take its course, and the potential implications of climate change, which suggests that we may need more active management than we have historically seen here. The slide on the right up there at the top it theoretically gives an idea of how one goes about trying to ensure the landscape is connected as opposed to broken into patches, on fragmented patches that make it quite difficult for animals and natural processes to evolve. At the bottom, it's a little hard to see, but that is an example of how both the agencies and conservation organizations are going about trying to connect the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And let's see here, let me see if I can get this to work. Here we have the Yellowstone National Park, and the idea is traveling west through the Centennial Mountains and protecting some corridor opportunities here. We can connect up to central Idaho wilderness areas. and as I'll show later, ultimately connect up to Glacier National Park and what's known as the Crown of the Continent ecosystem to the further north. So with that setting the stage, let me get into some of the issues that have evolved over time. Whoops. What happened here? I'm not advancing this, Sam, for some reason. If I hit the wrong button or what. Okay. Does that do it?
I should do it.
Okay, let's see. Okay, so sorry about that. First issue that I looked at is what has evolved with respect to resource management in the national parks in the Yellowstone area. Here I've outlined some of the issues that Yellowstone National Park has confronted, including very lengthy 20-year controversy over the appropriateness of unregulated snowmobile activity inside Yellowstone during the winter versus maintaining the area as a quiet, if you will, winter refuge. Battling federal courts that ultimately led to a Park Service resolution of this controversy that allows a limited number of snowmobiles in on a daily basis, and included some requirements for muffling and emissions. The Park Service seems to have struck the right chord today. It raised the real question of whether parks should be set aside as areas for quiet recreation or whether motorized recreation in a national park during this quiet winter season made sense, all driven by economic forces outside of the park, West Yellowstone billing itself as the snowmobile capital of the world. Lingering questions involve the tremendous growth as reflected on the numbers there in visitation. The Park Service clearly has the legal authority to limit visitation. The underlying question is, does it have the political will to utilize that authority? And you may have noticed that this same issue is playing out in our southern Utah parks. In fact, was a headline matter regarding Zion just a couple of days ago regarding potential limitations on visitation there. Moving into the wildlife, when discussing the wildlife issues, boundaries are all important. And it's clear that in order to maintain the wildlife populations here, that some sort of coordinated ecosystem management approach is necessary, but there are significant differences between federal law and state law in the national parks. Grizzly bears, for example, and literally all wildlife are protected against consumption or hunting, whereas outside of the national parks, it is state law that attaches unless an animal is protected under the Endangered Species Act, and the states all allow hunting in this particular area in different ways. Regarding the grizzly bear, in 1975, the federal government extended endangered species protection to it. 10 years later, the population was still on a steady decline, down somewhere around 150 to 200 bears, and a congressional subcommittee recommended that there needed to be a concerted effort, coordinated, to recover the bear. That in turn energized an interagency grizzly bear committee that brought federal and state land managers and wildlife managers together to move toward trying to stabilize, not only stabilize, but recover the grizzly bear population. The slide here gives you a sense of how that has evolved. With the bear being placed on the endangered species list, it is subject to federal oversight, not state management, and that has been a source of ongoing tension in the area. Twice, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has sought to take the grizzly bear off of the endangered species list. Twice, the federal courts have intervened and said, no, you did not appropriately approach the question of delisting, and the bear remains on the endangered species list, even though the number of bears is now well in excess of 600. One thing that has happened as the bear population has recovered, reflected on the map, is that its habitat has expanded outward. If you'll notice on the map, there's a yellow line. That was the initial primary recovery zone for the grizzly bear back in the 1970s, early 80s. But now the bear population extends all the way out to the purple line, and that in turn has created tension with local residents who are fearful of the presence of the bear, and conflicts between livestock management and the presence of grizzly bears in the area. At bottom, the question that's pending is whether or not the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals will sustain the 2018 Crow Indian Tribe ruling that basically extended the reach of the Endangered Species Act to require the agencies to consider connectivity between the Yellowstone bear population and the Northern Continental Divide bear population located up in the Glacier National Park area. A little more about that later. If management shifts to the states, they've already signaled that they will allow hunting of the bear, and when the 2017 delisting occurred, a conflict arose between the Park Service and the state of Montana over bear hunting on the perimeter of the park, and demonstrated a lack of coordination between the two. Wyoming was ready to authorize the take of 22 bears. That was unacceptable to the Park Service and a number of conservation organizations. Wolf restoration has occurred with the reintroduction of wolves under the Endangered Species Act in 1994. They were protected until the Fish and Wildlife Service sought to delist the Yellowstone population. That was blocked by litigation, but Congress was convinced to intervene, and as a result, the wolves are now delisted. They are subject to state management, and that in turn means that they're protected inside Yellowstone National Park, subject to hunting when they move outside of the park. That has created problems for the Yellowstone wolf managers, who have seen wolves that have provided considerable information through scientific studies being shot out on the border of the parks. What this suggested, among other things, the evolution of the wolf restoration effort is one, it was quite successful. Two, despite initial success in court, Congress had the final say here in response to powerful local political pressures. And with the delisting of the wolf, it also has demonstrated the lack of ongoing coordination between the parks and the states. Shifting to another animal, that is bison. This one is likewise jurisdictionally quite a complex issue. I've listed the major players in the slide. You can see there's lots of different agencies, including wildlife agencies, but also livestock agencies. The underlying concern is the risk yet to happen over 25, 30 years of the transmission of the brucellosis bacteria from bison to domestic livestock in the Yellowstone area. As a result of that risk, back in the 1990s, Montana transferred jurisdiction for bison from its wildlife department to its Department of Livestock. That has created additional tensions in trying to figure out a way to resolve this issue. Eventually, as occurred with the grizzly bear, the agencies came together in roughly the turn of the century, around 2000, created an interagency bison management committee to try to address the question of what happens, what ought to happen when the bison leave the park, as they inevitably do in the winter, seeking lower elevation habitat, and a interagency bison management plan was adopted in the year 2000. It provided that only limited number of bison would be allowed out of the park, and that other bison who left the park would be rounded up, captured, and put through a test and slaughter protocol in order to avoid potential contact with livestock. The net effect of that is that roughly 10,000 bison have been killed under that process, and the state of Montana is basically dictating the fate of Yellowstone's bison. We're seeing some movement on this over time, with a couple of things happening. Gradual willingness to allow more bison in different areas outside of the park, and an emerging effort to transfer bison from Yellowstone to Native American reservations where the tribes are interested in restoring bison. And in 2012, an initial transfer occurred up to the Fort Peck Indian Reservation. There have been a couple of other small transfers. The state of Montana is still quite leery about allowing the movement of bison within the state without quarantine and testing to assure that they are disease-free. If we can begin to move more bison, we have at least a partial solution to the bison management issue. One of the ironies that lurks here is that recently the National Academy of Sciences had a commission that studied the brucellosis problem and concluded that bison were not the main problem. It turns out that elk in the area are carriers of brucellosis, and that in fact of the roughly 8 to 12 instances where there's been transmission of brucellosis from wildlife to livestock, it's been the elk that are responsible for that. The bison have never yet been shown to be responsible for that sort of transmission. Underlying question: should Yellowstone's bison be managed as wildlife or as domestic livestock? I mentioned elk. Exciting new information emerging with the use of collaring and radio telemetry and that sort of technology, enabling scientists to better understand the life cycles and patterns of migratory elk. And what you see on the slide here are, in the darker colors, are established migration patterns now that have been shown for elk. And notice that seasonally, as they move from higher to lower elevation out of Yellowstone and Grand Teton Park to lower elevation, that they cross many jurisdictional boundaries, moving from park lands to forest lands to private lands to lower elevation Bureau of Land Management lands, and that in turn further highlights the jurisdictional issues that are confronted here. Interestingly, in recent years, there's been quite a bit, in addition to this scientific information coming in, there's been political support to begin to acknowledge these migration routes and corridors and to provide some level of legal protection. Secretary of the Interior Zinke, when he was in office, issued a secretarial order providing that protection. Wyoming is engaged in a migration initiative. The Western Governors Association has endorsed some level of protection for migratory routes, and what you see here is political support for that, for this particular animal and its life cycle needs. I probably should also note, and it's perhaps is evident with this information about the scope of migration of elk, pronghorn, and deer in the area, it has effectively enlarged the size of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and moved it onto what many regard as a landscape scale. A success story that emerged about 10 to 15 years ago was the various agencies, Park Service, Forest Service, BLM, State of Wyoming, conservation organizations, private landowners, all coming together to create the first official federal wildlife migration corridor, what's known as the Path of the Pronghorn, shown in the slide on the your left up there, where the Forest Service officially protected in the Bridger-Teton National Forest the migration corridor there. Private landowners willingly granted conservation easements to allow passage of the pronghorn across private ranch lands, and the Wyoming Highway Department, working with its own and federal funds, agreed to construct a wildlife overpass on the highway between Jackson and Pinedale. That overpass is shown in one of the slides there. I should note that the terminus there at the bottom of the slide, just beyond Trappers Point, takes the pronghorn migration just south of Pinedale and puts it right next to the Pinedale Anticline Oil and Gas Development Project. More about that in just a minute or two. But this demonstrates how the agencies can come together to coordinate to secure nature conservation objectives. I should also note that pending in Congress is a proposed federal Wildlife Corridors Protection Act. It's been introduced in the last two Congress. Remains to be seen whether it has legs to move at this point in time. The other elk issue that is pending that many people are not aware of is that the state of Wyoming, along with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through the National Elk Refuge north of Jackson. Many of you have probably seen the National Elk Refuge, provides winter feeding for elk due to loss of habitat and loss of migration corridors. The problem here is that with brucellosis, this commingling of elk and occasionally bison on these feed grounds is a perfect incubator for the passage of or transmittal of these infectious diseases. Add to that the recent arrival in western Wyoming in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem of chronic wasting disease. There is a serious concern about the presence of the feed grounds and efforts by conservation organizations and others to have the state of Wyoming do away with its winter feed grounds. They were put in place to protect the interests of ranchers, where elk were congregating in their hay fields and eating the feed that was available for their domestic livestock. Montana has officially objected to the presence of the feed grounds, and a federal court recently told the Forest Service that it would have to redo its NEPA analysis because of the presence of chronic wasting disease before granting the state a permit to continue to maintain the Alkali Flats feed ground that's noted in one of the lower slides there. Again, what you see here is a lack of coordinated management policy respecting elk management in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, and both federal, state, but also state-state tension between Wyoming and the other surrounding states. So that's what I want to do with wildlife. Let me shift gears and turn to the national forest. 30 years ago, this was the site of major concern on the part of conservation organizations and perceived as a major threat to the integrity of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Timber management in the national forest, particularly in the Targhee, was problematic. The Targhee in the late 60s had the largest timber sale in the lower 48, resulting in substantial clear cutting, including right up to the border of Yellowstone. You can see the line that extends in that lower left-hand slide. That is the border of Yellowstone Park, with the right-hand side reflecting the clear cutting on the national forest. Conservation organizations challenged the timber policies repeatedly in terms of their impact on wildlife, ultimately convinced the Forest Service to alter its plans, and with a 1997 revision to its forest plan, the Targhee reduced its timber sales by 90%. At that point in time, the two large timber mills in St. Anthony and Rexburg, Idaho closed, and the Forest Service moving forward has moved away from that sort of extensive commercial type of harvesting in the area. I should note that in the state of Wyoming, over the last roughly 30 years, the number of timber mills has dropped from 50 to a dozen. Give you a sense of how timber has come off of the high priority list on the national forest. Today, to just look at the one bottom slide, the principal type of timber activity that's occurring in the national forest is ecological restoration to try to address the wildfire concern with cutting of small diameter timber in order to minimize the risk of fire near what's become known as the WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface Zone, to protect private property owners who have lands, and there are many of them in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem adjacent to national forest lands or even national park lands in some instances. I put up a map on the other side of an interesting development during the 90s. North of Yellowstone Park, shown in the purple at the bottom there, is the Gallatin National Forest, and you get a sense that there still is to some degree, significant checkerboard lands, the result of the railroad era, and timber companies held checkerboarded lands in that sort of dark blue area, and were poised to either cut or subdivide those lands, this being an important critical wildlife corridor for critters to move out of Yellowstone up the crest of the Gallatin Range. And in the mid-1990s, Congress, at the behest of conservation organizations and the agencies, negotiated major land exchanges that put those lands into the hands of the U.S. Forest Service, which it in turn is now treating as a wilderness study area for potential wilderness designation, taking the threat of development or clear cutting off of the table. Oil and gas development. 30 years ago was a major concern. It prompted a lot of litigation. During the 90s, it started to tamp down, but in the early 2000s, the Jonah field and the Pinedale Anticline field were discovered by the oil companies, and that access was available through new technologies, hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, and we had the third largest gas field in the United States come online there south of Pinedale, with proposed something in the neighborhood of 5,000 wells being proposed in the area. Conservation organizations went to court to try to block the build out. They lost. And as a result, today we see in that area the industrialization of roughly 200,000 acres of BLM land that's situated on the edge of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. The important point, I think, is that although this oil and gas activity has gone forward, 30 years ago there was fear of oil and gas activity in the GYE National Forest. That has not come to pass. They've largely been spared. And in 2000, the Bridger Teton supervisor even withdrew substantial acreage north of Jackson Hole in response to local concerns about not industrializing that part of the world. Just this past year, a federal court in Washington, D.C. enjoined further oil and gas development across much of Wyoming on the grounds that the BLM had not appropriately considered greenhouse gas emissions and climate change impacts. That's where things stand at the moment. The Pinedale development, though, triggered concern for the national forest lands in the Wyoming range west of Pinedale. If you look at the map, map, you'll see the green and blue showing the Jonah and the Pinedale anticline oil fields. Leap to the west of that, and you have the Wyoming range, and local interests from all walks of life came together and convinced Congress to pass what's known as the Wyoming Range Legacy Act that put that area out of bounds for future oil and gas development, withdrew the lands, also opened the door for conservation groups to buy out existing lessees, all ultimately protecting the Wyoming range from oil and gas development, because in the view of people living in the area, again from all walks of life, it was too special of a place and too precious to drill. It's noteworthy, particularly that this occurred in Wyoming, where mineral development is really the heart of the state's economy. I should also note that recently the Shoshone National Forest and its revised forest plan limited oil and gas development on what's known as the Absaroka-Beartooth Front. That would be immediately east of Yellowstone National Park as you move out of the park down toward Cody and Red Lodge, Montana, and that area. Mining, historically, quite active in the Yellowstone area. In the early 1990s, a Canadian company came forth and proposed to go back into the New World Mining District north of Cook City. That provoked quite a bit of conflict and protest among local citizens that were able, with the help of conservation organizations, to bring the campaign to a national level, secure editorial support in the New York Times and otherwise. That ultimately caught the attention of the White House, and President Clinton actually stepped in and intervened, and that mining project was stopped through a series of negotiations with the Canadian company. But mining is an ever-present threat in the area, and just within the last 3 or 4 years, new mining proposals surfaced above Chico Hot Springs, if any of you are familiar with that area, in the Immigrant Peak area. Again, local citizens, conservation organizations came together to protest this and secured some relief in court. But ultimately were able to convince the Secretary of the Interior, both Sally Jewell and Ryan Zinke, to administratively withdraw the federal lands from mining activity north of Yellowstone Park. That yellow line, incidentally, in the map shows the border of Yellowstone Park, and you get a sense of location of some of the mining projects. And ultimately, last session, Congress adopted the Yellowstone Gateway Protection Act that formally withdrew these lands north of the park from any further mining activity, demonstrating the significance of Yellowstone and the evolving changes in the local economy and community to promote conservation values rather than development values. That's not all the mining that occurs in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. In the southwest corner in the of the ecosystem and the southeastern corner of Idaho, the Caribou National Forest, the phosphate mining has been going on for some time. It's quite important locally in terms of its economic importance and the jobs that it creates. And despite efforts to go to court and try to block expansion of the phosphate mines, the conservation groups have been unsuccessful in stopping that. This has basically become sort of a sacrifice zone, 46,000 acres involved in the phosphate mining in this area, making it a heavily industrialized area. It suggests to me that at the edges of the GYE, that the concept itself and ecosystem management concerns are less resonant. On the national forests, another issue that has percolated for 30 years is whether or not to designate additional wilderness. And wilderness, of course, is the most protective designation that Congress can make. It is a political decision. It's up to Congress to decide whether to designate wilderness. And as the map shows, you'll see that Yellowstone Park and Grand Teton are bordered by substantial wilderness acreage, but not so much to the west and to some degree to the northwest of the area. There have been active proposals to try to designate additional wilderness over the last 30 plus years, and the bottom line is nothing has passed Congress. They've all run into roadblocks of one sort or another. And it remains to be seen whether we'll see any new wilderness designations. There have been a couple major efforts recently, both in Wyoming and Montana, and they've come to naught with both conflict between wilderness advocates and timber interests, also off-road vehicle interests, and within the conservation community itself as to how pure a wilderness bill ought to be. I probably should also note the Forest Service has not been all that receptive to new wilderness proposals. The Shoshone National Forest recent plan recommended 0 additional acreage, wilderness acreage. That said, with the adoption of the Clinton-era roadless rule, roughly 2 million acres enjoys that level of protection. It's not wilderness, but it's close to wilderness protection. Here we have the current wilderness battle that's playing out, and it involves this Gallatin Crest area north of Yellowstone National Park and Highlight Porcupine Buffalo Horn Wilderness Study Area, and the citizens of Bozeman, conservation groups, the agencies, etc., are in the midst of a rigorous debate over whether or not to grant full wilderness protection to this wilderness study area, or to allow certain special management areas for motorized groups, mountain biking, and other sorts of non-wilderness types of activities. Forest Service has released a draft forest plan, and it remains to be seen what they'll ultimately recommend in their final forest plan. Backcountry recreation continues or has grown in terms of conflict. The concern is over recreational activities and wildlife and environmental impacts, also conflicts among users, motorized versus non-motorized type of backcountry users, snowmobiles, backcountry heli-skiing, that sort of thing. And the Forest Service has been sued over its management of wilderness study areas and recreational activities there, with the courts generally saying that you cannot allow motorized type of activities in wilderness study areas, and you have to take a careful look when you move outside of wilderness study areas to multiple use backcountry forest lands. Changing gears, I'm getting near the end here. Private lands. 30 years ago, the conservation efforts focused almost entirely on public lands. But during the past 30 years, we've seen explosive population growth in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The result of that has been the loss of open space and important habitat. Private lands tend to be located at lower elevations, which means they're good for winter habitat. Also riparian areas, which draw critters, and they have been subject to, that is the ranch lands in the area, have been subject to subdivision. That brings people, roads, fences, dogs, and the like, and that in turn impacts wildlife. The 3 Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem states, as you might imagine, being Rocky Mountain Western states, have generally resisted strong land use and zoning controls. So the legal handles available to address the private land issue are limited. I probably should note that one slide up in the upper left-hand corner where you see Bozeman superimposed against Minneapolis. At current population growth rates, by roughly 2040, so 20 to 25 years from now, if the population growth continues, Bozeman will be the size of Minneapolis. pretty hard to contemplate that, but if current rates continue. So we do have one example of a very powerful local land use plan, and that's in Teton County, Wyoming, Jackson Hole. Some have suggested that if Jackson Hole, with all of the wealth that's located there, can't get it right, then what's the likely fate of the rest of the GYE regarding private land use? There are provisions in state law, in each of the state's laws, for the use of conservation easements to protect private lands for conservation purposes. Currently, about 750,000 acres of private land are under some sort of conservation easement in the GYE. There are potential problems with conservation easements. I go into it in the article. I won't bother you with what a couple of the problems that have surfaced are. Ranching is clearly in transition. Large ranches being sold, some to traditional ranchers, others for subdivision purposes. That in turn creates the sort of fragmentation problem that I talked about previously. We have amenity buyers who are willing to grant conservation easements in some instances. We even have conservation real estate firms who sell to conservation purchasers. But we have, it's a mixed bag in terms of what's happening on the lands that end up in amenity buyer hands. Some are open to conservation, others regard them as private retreats. We do have traditional ranchers continuing on the land. They graze their livestock on public lands, and that in turn opens the door for potential conflict with predators, think grizzly bears and wolves. What has happened has been a concerted effort by both the agencies and conservation groups to engage in grazing allotment buyouts with a focus on sheep allotments, taking a market type approach to solving this problem rather than a regulatory approach. Roughly 1 million acres have been retired by the Forest Service and the BLM out of livestock grazing. That has helped to reduce the conflict. Final major slide here, talking about private lands. This illustrates on a broad scale this high divide area northwest of Yellowstone Park. You have the outlines of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, and then to the north, the outlines of the Crown of the Continent ecosystem. Conservation groups and federal land management agencies have been working to try to provide an opportunity for connectivity between these two ecosystems, trending westward and northward through the central Idaho wilderness area to allow wildlife, particularly grizzly bears, to connect through the area through the use of conservation easements on private ranch lands. There's lots of large ranches in that area and other sorts of protections on the federal lands. It's a movement that has brought a lot of people together. It's moving forward. It's, I think, an indication of what the future holds, and perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates a recognition that the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem alone is not sufficient to meet all of the conservation needs. Looking into the future, that we need to think on broad landscape scale terms in order to ensure the long-term ecological integrity of the area, including the welfare of the animals. There's particular concern that it's necessary to connect the two grizzly bear populations to ensure genetic diversity over the long haul. It demonstrates the power of collaborative landscape conservation efforts. So, conclusions. During the last 30 years, primary threats in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem on the national forests have mostly not come to pass. Got some exceptions: the mining in southeastern Idaho, the oil field in central Wyoming. Wildlife populations remain in generally good condition. Habitat concerns still remain. No new formal wilderness acreage but we have seen the passage of the Wyoming Range Legacy Act and implementation of the roadless rule. I didn't mention that during the last 30 years, 3 segments of major rivers in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem have been designated wild and scenic rivers by Congress. The presence of the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee helps to validate the idea that this is an ecosystem and needs to be managed in that way. The notions, the practice of interagency coordination is still an evolving matter. The change that we've seen has been piecemeal, pretty much issue by issue, solve the grizzly bear problem, try to solve the bison problem, etc. And that that's a reflection of the jurisdictional complexity that continues to exist in the region. The concept of a Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, widely embraced these days, and is being expanded, I think, to this larger landscape scale. Ecosystem management itself, a work in progress, the different forces that work, economic, demographic change, land use changes, changes within the agencies. Scientists have played a role validating the GYE concept and the notions underlying ecosystem management and landscape conservation. Federal law and litigation have been major players to, in particular, deter the heavy-duty industrial activity in the national forests and to promote a broader conservation agenda. But Congress is always lurking in the background, and likewise the state legislatures are lurking in the background and have had the final say in some instances. Looking ahead, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem concept is serving more and more as a regional identity, unifying the area to around the idea that the conservation values are worth promoting and focusing on, but the jurisdictional complexity remains. There's a continued need for an ecosystem management approach, new threats, visitation to the area, and what that means in terms of recreation, wildlife disease, and how we're going to deal with particularly chronic wasting disease, climate change, and private land development and the habitat fragmentation that brings. We're moving toward embracing landscape scale conservation and the need for connectivity within the area. On the legal front, state law is assuming greater and greater importance. Once the grizzly bear is delisted, which will happen at some point in time, all of the critters in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem will be under state management when they leave the national parks. And likewise, private land oversight is in the hands of state and local government. There's a continuing need to improve coordination at all levels, including at the federal, state, and state levels. I think we're not likely to see, if you will, a comprehensive umbrella silver bullet solution, but that these issues will continue to be addressed piecemeal on an individual basis, and that conflicts will also continue to be addressed both locally and at a national level. So for the final word, I'll leave it to John Muir, who made the point that we need to think in ecosystem terms. You've been very patient. Thank you. People are interested, yeah.
We do have time for questions. If you could use the microphone, that would be helpful.
Yeah, you talked about ranchers and miners and government and tourists and so on, but there's a community I think you haven't touched on, and that's the Indian tribes that occupy parts of all of these western states. Do they have any common views on these issues of development around Greater Yellowstone?
What I think we're seeing in terms of, it's a very good question, in terms of Native American interest and engagement. 30 years ago, very little Native American engagement, including with the bison issue. And what I think has emerged not only in the Yellowstone region, but frankly in our own backyard here in Utah and elsewhere on public lands, is that the tribes have gotten much more involved in recent last decade or two. Most obvious example of that is the tribal proposal for the Bears Ears National Monument in here in southern Utah. But the tribes are now deeply engaged in the bison issue in Yellowstone. The Fort Peck the tribe at Fort Peck Reservation has even created a quarantine facility to receive bison from Yellowstone Park and to put them through a quarantine protocol before they would be released on the reservation or alternatively transferred to other Native American reservations. The Wind River tribe in Wyoming has recently restored bison and are looking to Yellowstone as a potential source of additional bison. If you noticed during with the grizzly bear slide, it was the Crow Indian tribe that was the lead plaintiff on that particular litigation. It's the first time they've weighed in on grizzly bear issues. And Yellowstone Park itself has recognized that historically there are something in the neighborhood of 22 or 24 tribes that have cultural and historic attachments to the park, and consequently moving forward and in recent years the park has been consulting with those tribes when it has proposals for actions, etc. So I think this is an evolving relationship that we will see strengthen in the years ahead. You're right, I didn't emphasize it because up until very recently it really has not been in the forefront in that area.
Sorry, my name is Dan Potts. I'm with the 100-year-old Salt Lake Fish and Game Foundation. My question is, with all you've learned relative to this Greater Yellowstone thing, how could that relate to our more local Antelope Island? We've got a little model there that's teeny tiny in comparison, and you would think it would be isolated because of salt water, but we continue to see great big trophy bucks wade or swim to shore at the International Center. But so how and the wildlife resources and the state parks have long since butted heads on that particular little thing. Bless the beast and the children. If you're younger, you may not relate to that. Thank you.
Excuse me. I'm not totally familiar with the different Antelope Island issues. I know the basic outlines. I think it's another example where we thought we had an enclave where the Great Salt Lake provided a perimeter around the island, and that was sufficient to proceed with protection of the bison and the other ungulates that are found and animals that are found on the island. With the lake lowering in size, it's become evident that that's a permeable boundary, which is the same thing that we have in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, and that in order to effectively manage the wildlife on the island going forward, we're going to have some coordination between the different agencies, the state park, the wildlife agency, but also I suspect the local communities. Where if bison are coming across and getting into local communities, they're going to be concerned about what the implications of that are. Again, the need for coordination to address that sort of an issue. Yes, ma'am.
Are the four-legged or the two-legged people going to be the winners of it in 20 years? Will my grandchildren be able to go out and see these things that we can see today?
Yeah. The question is basically what's Yellowstone going to look like in 20 years? Will all the animals that are there today be there in 20 years? The project that I'm engaged with, and that both conservation groups and the agencies also are engaged with, is an effort to make sure that the answer is yes to that question. And the only way to make sure that occurs, as I've just argued, is to manage the area as an interconnected entity, to try to surmount all of these legal boundaries and barriers and jurisdictional hurdles that are out on the ground to ensure the long-term integrity of the wildlife resources and other features that are there. I didn't even get into the battle over the geysers and the hot water pots and everything else, and the plumbing, which extends outside of the park boundaries, etc. But I think that we've seen progress. My bottom line is we've seen progress over the last 30 years, and I'm cautiously optimistic we will continue to see progress, but we still have hurdles to cross, and they're different ones, and they present the same or even more challenges than the old ones. It was sort of easy, if you will, from the conservation community to demonize, the loggers or the miners or the drillers as the bad guys who are disrupting the natural features on the landscape and the species, et cetera, et cetera. But the current culprit, frankly, is us. In the form of private land development, recreational activity, visitation, just the sheer numbers of people that are in the area, all looking for more or less the same thing, a nice place to play or visit in paradise. And that's a challenge that's different than the ones that we faced in the past. And I think the agencies are going to have to come to grips with, are there appropriate constraints or limitations that ought to be and can be imposed to protect the natural qualities of the area, which really define not only its natural appearance, but frankly its cultural and economic importance in today's world. Yes, ma'am. Okay, I'm sorry, you said water? Yeah, okay. So I think the question is, what are the water conservation efforts afoot there? The GYE area it's western. It's a dry landscape. It's not quite as dry as our landscape here in Utah. But what we've seen occur with respect to water is efforts to ensure free-flowing stretches of the rivers are protected with the wild and scenic river designations. There have been some back and forth over appropriate consumption of water, whether agricultural or municipal, and that sort of thing. I don't think things have come to a serious head up there. There have been water compacts reached between the state of Montana and the federal agencies that provide and recognize Federal Reserve water rights for some of the GYE parks. That's sort of the extent of my knowledge on that particular issue, but I know that there are great sensitivities to ensuring that water is conserved and protected, and that the waterways are important. Okay, thank you.